the Mazda RX7. It's a car that's gone from popular to hated to legendary. It's one of the most unique automotive experiences you can have. I'm Austin, and this is why the Mazda RX7 is one of the greatest cars of all time. So first, what is the RX7? Well, it's a small engine, traditional sports coupe made by Mazda. The engine itself is part of what makes this car unique. Every video essay on the RX-7 talks about it, but come on, we gotta touch on the rotary engine. Although Mazda didn't create it, they did get the design to a point where it was usable. The rotary engine is a little bit different from a piston engine, where a piston engine has rods and different things moving up and down and back and forth. The rotary engine, as you see in front of you, the rotary engine is a single Dorito, also known as a rouleau triangle, that moves around inside of the housing, doing all the jobs that a normal piston engine would on its own.
Piston engine go. Let the Mazda go.
And although it may not have been the most powerful engine even in its time, it was still described as sporty and fun by the owners of cars such as the RX-3 and Cosmo, the predecessors of the RX-7. Taking this in mind, Mazda got to work making their first real sports car using the rotary engine. The first generation RX-7 released in 1978 for a little under $7,000 US. With inflation factored in today, that's about $32,500, which is honestly not too far off from a modern Miata. For your money, you got a car styled to look like the Lotus Elan, complete with pop-up headlights. The FB RX-7 came with a 12A twin rotor engine, and it made a staggering 100 horsepower. It was a simple car, and instead of having fancy independent rear suspension, had a live axle. Also came with drum brakes, essentially meaning the only truly complex part of this car was the engine itself. That was the only foreign thing to new buyers. To also keep the car simple, Mazda made a deliberate choice to have the car's weight distribution be 50-50. This means 50% of the weight is in the front, 50% of the weight is in the back. It's balanced like that. This and a midship design meant the car felt perfectly balanced to drive and was genuinely fun to be in. This spunky little car from the 70s quite possibly saved Mazda and sold in the hundreds of thousands. It was the best-selling generation of the RX-7. When your old man tells you he had an RX-7 at one point, he's probably talking about this one. The second generation RX-7, also known as the FC, came out in 1985 looking like a Porsche 944 or a 928 with a price tag of around $10,000 MSRP. Now, admittedly, I'm not super sure if this is the real price, but this is data that's harder to find than you'd think, so if anybody knows otherwise, please tell me in the comments below. I'd love to be corrected. This car did manage to fix some of the first gen's issues. The suspension was so simple in the first generation's car that it had a nasty habit of wheel hopping in corners. And I don't know about you, but when I'm driving my car, I don't like it when it jumps. Also, for all the fun of the rotary engine, 100 horsepower really wasn't enough. So Mazda came out with a turbo option, making a respectable 182 horsepower. Although the first gen FB did have a turbo variant, it really wasn't widespread. This is the first generation where it was widely available. In Japan, for instance, you could only get the car turbo. There was no naturally aspirated version, meaning no forced induction for extra air. I don't really want to explain turbos right now, but like, Google it. This car was also given plenty of 80s future tech along with it. With these changes, they tried to make this car more of a touring car than a pure sports car. And with this, they gave this car plenty of future 80s tech to make it even better. So the car was longer. It had bigger wheels. It had rear wheel steering. 4 wheels turning at the same time. Automatic seat belt. It had electronic suspension. The FC also has my personal favorite edition of the RX-7s, known as the Infinity line. These had reduced weight, differently tuned engines making more horsepower, super special seats that would suck your butt in if you need it, and special paint jobs like this beautiful green. And if I really had to pick one car out of the list to get, I would probably get one out of the Infinity line. However, there weren't a lot of them made, and they were only released in Japan. The final car in the RX-7 lineup is arguably the most important. In 1991, Mazda released their magnum opus, the FD RX-7. This time it took zero inspiration from anything else. Mazda let their car designers run wild and create something gorgeous. The car had smooth lines from one end to another, a linked taillight keeping with the non-stop sweeping motion. It was to the point they couldn't even break up the door with a handle. They had to put it in the windows to make sure the looks of the car wouldn't be compromised. And the engineers designing the thing didn't want to be outdone, so they made the engine even better too. This car came with a sequential turbo 13B 2-rotor. That's a lot of car words I just threw at you. So let's break it down a little bit to make sure you're still with me. The twin rotor means it has 2 rotary engines linked together, like the first car. 13B is just what the engine's called. And then sequential turbos is the really interesting part. This means you have one small turbo that is spinning up a big old turbo that's making all the power. This way, you never really have a spot where the turbo feels like it's lagging behind. Now, that's a really fancy way of saying this car is pretty fast. It made around 255 horsepower and it could do to 60 of around 5.4 seconds. That's still a pretty decent time for cars today. The RX-7 FD is truly worthy of being on the Mount Rushmore of cars. I know what you're thinking. This car, it's the best thing ever. It's amazing and I want one right now. I'm gonna go to Mazda, I'm gonna buy 40 of them. But there's a reason I titled the video what I did. Flawed perfection. The 3rd gen RX-7 came out with an MSRP of $31,000. That's nearly $70,000 today. That's more than a Corvette C8. And it was just too expensive. Meanwhile, for such a small engine, they never really got good gas mileage. The FD averaged about 21 miles per gallon, which is more like an SUV than a car. From my own experiences and conversations, it likely gets a lot less than that. Not to mention all the fancification of the engine, like the sequential turbos that made it all fun, kind of made it really temperamental and sometimes troublesome to run. All that being said, the 3rd gen ended up being pulled from the North American market after 3 years in 1995. Although the line had a full run in Japan until 2002, it did mark the end of the RX-7 name. Unfortunately, the follow-up of the RX-8 never really managed to hit the same high points as its predecessor. So why do we still talk about this car? Well, it's still one of the most unique things you can drive on the planet. That 50/50 mid-engine design was kept for its entire lifespan. It was always so well balanced. The rotary engine doesn't just sound like it wants you to go fast, it wants to go fast. These things love being run out, driving them hard through every single gear, to the point Mazda had to put in a warning buzzer sound to make sure you wouldn't overrun it like in a race car. And speaking of race cars, the RX-7 was good enough to win the entire IMSA GTU category for 7 years in a row, to the point they made special editions of the cars celebrating how good it was. The RX-7 was also propped up by all kinds of mainstream media. Absolute hit movies such as The Fast and Furious, featuring Dom and his very own RX-7 FD. Video games like Gran Turismo let you experience driving it without even owning one. At 10 years old, you can have your own RX-7. And that was pretty dang cool. On the more weeb side of things, you also had things like Initial D, starring a yellow and white FC as the 2 main antagonists of the show. This was enough for me to go out and buy one myself. This is my real 1988 RX-7 and I love it. I would never want to own a different car. For all of its flaws and all of its issues, in my opinion, it still really is the perfect car. Thank you so much for watching. This is my first time doing something like this with the script, so if it feels a little shaky, sorry. The editing time for me was also kind of short. This is a whole new process for me. I got a couple more of these coming out. Hopefully the next ones are gonna feel a little more polished. It was either gonna be me doing a show about cars or a show about Gundam, and as much as I love Gundam, I thought cars probably be a little easier to talk about. If you enjoyed this and you're excited for another video, make sure to sub to the channel. It really would tell me that I'm doing something correctly. Hope you can tune in again. I don't know why I saluted. I'm not in the military. Bye. Have a good day.